Welcome to Tech Talks, the conversation series of the Psychology of Technology Institute. This is a conversation about the future of privacy with Michal, Kosinski, Leslie John, and Azim Shariff. These psychologists have each approached the question of digital privacy from a different angle. Michal from the standpoint of big data, Leslie from the standpoint of cognitive biases, and Azim from the standpoint of evolutionary mismatch. We hope you love the conversation.
Okay, well, hi everybody, and welcome to Tech Talk with the Psychology of Technology Institute. I'm Nate Fast, co-director of the Institute, along with Juliana Schroeder. I'm also associate professor of management and organization at USC Marshall. We're going to be talking today about privacy, which is a huge topic, and I'm really excited to have three distinguished guests with us today who are studying privacy from different angles. And so let's jump right in. I'll introduce our guests and we'll jump into the conversation. So first of all, we have Leslie John, who is a behavioral scientist and professor at the Harvard Business School. She studies how people make decisions about their health, as well as what drives people to share or withhold their private information. And she also looks at people's reactions to companies and employers when they use their personal data. Next, we have Michal Kosinski, an associate professor in organizational behavior at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, where he studies humans in digital environments using cutting edge, computational methods, AI, big data, you name it. And then for the second time, we have Azim Shariff, who is a social psychologist at the University of British Columbia, whose research focuses on the intersection of morality with religion, cultural attitudes, and economics, as well as human technology interactions and the ethics of automation. So welcome to all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Wonderful. So a couple of years ago, and I'm sure you all remember this, the New York Times Privacy Project got access to the largest and most sensitive data file that journalists have ever had a chance to review. And so what this was 50 billion location pings, individual location sites of individual smartphones of over 12 million Americans. And this followed them for a few months between 2016 and 2017. And so the sources of this data were anonymous, and they asked to remain anonymous because they were not authorized to share this data, but they shared it with the New York Times because they were so concerned about the abuses that could happen and how this data, could be used. And they wanted lawmakers and the public to be aware of this. The article is really fascinating. You can find it and we'll link to it, but describing the data, because what they did was they identified a few people. It's not hard to identify, people when you attach it to their physical locations over time. And then they went and talked to some of the people to get their reactions. And so there was a sheriff's deputy who they talked to, who actually winced when he saw like these thick red lines between the police station where he worked and his house, where his family lived. Of course, he was concerned about safety. And then another was a data scientist or a scientist who worked at NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, who said that the data set would be a treasure trove for spy agencies who wanted to get, personal information and target individuals who worked at NASA. And so this story is really interesting for a number of reasons. It has a lot of themes that we want to look at, right? The invasiveness of the data, how will the public respond to learning about this data, the fact that this data was shared even though it was not supposed to be shared, and on and on. The other thing about this data is it's just one of many, many types of information that we're sharing about ourselves in today's society. And so we want to really dig into that. And one of the pieces of the puzzle of all of this is psychology and the psychology of privacy and why people share, why people don't share, protect their data or don't protect their data. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about kind of like what's at stake here. Why should we care? And what are some of the implications of this sharing of data? And we'll start with Michal. And so Michal, like what's the harm in sharing the data that we share, especially let's think about for a minute the social media landscape and just, sharing innocent things like likes and retweets or our pictures. If we, curate a few pictures that we put online, what is potentially harmful about that? It seems pretty innocent. And it seems like your research is, people have big reactions to your research. They often react negatively simply because they don't like the outcomes. But I just want to preface it by saying I think that you're serving a really important role in society by exposing some of what can happen with this data. And so I see that as a really important function that you're doing. But would love to hear a little bit about what you have found with likes, faces, those types of data.
Thank you, Nate. So I think that's, well, first of all, people I think tend to overestimate how much, I'm actually doing myself. And my goal is what I do is I look at existing algorithms and existing data sets that people collected for other purposes and algorithms that are already working and are being used by companies and other institutions, and trying to expose the applications that those algorithms have and reasons for which they're used. And I think it's to some degree exposing the degree to which people don't realize how intrusive those algorithms can be, that they react not only with surprise, but also they ascribe, the creation of those algorithms to me, completely forgetting that I wouldn't even know how to design algorithms of that kind. And just to build a little on your story related to those geographical locations, this data set of geographical locations, it's worth noting that this is, first of all, this data set actually is pretty small. It's just, few million people and not few hundreds of million of people, that many companies and many organizations, from Facebook and Google through your social media company to this little game that you installed on your smartphone, and while installing it, you gave it access to the history of your geographical location. And there's essentially a very wide number of organizations that collect and store such data. And then we should also realize that this data is being traded. There are huge marketplaces online where you can essentially, for few cents, purchase the history of geographical locations and other intimate information for tens or hundreds of millions of individuals. So you don't even need to be collecting data yourself to easily get access to it. So the first misconception is that it's just, New York Times or just the NSA that can access this data. Your little funny game that you have on your phone is collecting very similar data about you and others. Now, the other misconception that people have is that history of geographical locations is mostly revealing your geographical location. It is, but there's also so much more that you can learn from this data. Like, for example, your religious views by checking where you go on Saturday morning or Friday morning, and what are your patterns of commuting around your town? What are the people that you're hanging out with, right? Having your own location and combining it with locations of other people that a given institution has access to can reveal what kind of you're associated with, and thus what religious views you have, what political views you have, what sexual orientation you have, where you work, how much you earn, whether you're cheating on your partner, and so on. And this information can be revealed using extremely simple algorithms. We're not talking here about modern AI and supercomputers. We're talking here about linear regression and 1960s methodology.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and yeah, very interesting territory that we've entered into. And I'm wondering what if you could say a little bit about what you've been able to, with your research, demonstrate the power of creating algorithms that can predict our behaviors through likes, or predict our preferences through likes, or predict our preferences or things about us through just our faces. And I know you've done some work on faces, and I'm wondering, first of all, what are you finding there? And secondly, is it about the physical kind of structure, something inherent to our biology in our faces that is revealing information, or is it the pictures that we happen to choose to post, or whether we wear glasses or not, or the choices that we're making about self-presentation, or it's maybe a combination of both?
Well, Nate, the choices that we are making are still grounded in our biology, in the biology of our brain. So, so yes, at the end of the day, it's a very powerful and very wet computer that we are carrying in our heads that's is driving our behavior and enabling those predictions. When I started, I was looking at Facebook likes originally, quite a few years ago now. Back in 2012, Facebook patented a technology, patented algorithms which were advertised as algorithms that allow taking Facebook likes and other types of Facebook behavior and translating those into detailed psychological profiles. And psychologists were essentially pretty skeptical about this. We all know how difficult it is to create and validate a personality questionnaire or intelligence questionnaire. It takes a lot of work, and the accuracy of such tools is limited, as we all know. So people were really skeptical whether you can estimate such traits based on Facebook likes. And there was another dimension to it, which is at the time when Facebook patented this technology, Facebook likes were publicly visible on the internet. You could go to facebook.com, type in any username or any user ID, and Facebook will show you all of their likes and their name and their date of birth and other personal details. Now, if it turned out, my research essentially has shown that this is true, that those algorithms work, that Facebook was as advertised by Facebook, and you can take Facebook likes and predict people's personality, intelligence, political views, whether their parents were divorced or not, whether they are using substances or not, and a very broad range of other psychological and demographic traits. And if you combine this fact with the information that those likes were publicly available online for anyone to look at, well, this was creating a huge privacy risk. Facebook, actually, after the publication of this article, tightened the privacy rules, and Facebook likes became private by default, but it was too late essentially. And companies like Cambridge Analytica and others were already able to collect enough data to invade the privacy of hundreds of millions of Americans. And just to quickly refer to my more recent research, where we essentially have shown that the same intimate information can be also extracted from other sources of data, such as people's profile pictures. And it turns out that combination of how you are carrying yourself, what style people apply to looking after their faces, what makeup they use, what facial hairstyle they adopt, facial expressions, how the pictures are taken. And maybe those factors are very difficult to disentangle in studies employing social media pictures, but it might be that even some, more innate characteristics of the face allow modern facial recognition algorithms to extract intimate details such as personality, political orientation, and so on from a single profile picture.
Yeah, wow, that's very fascinating, fascinating work, and so I think it's clear that what we share matters. I'm convinced, among other things, your research has shown that, and so let's turn our attention to why do we share this personal information in the first place? What's the psychology behind that? And I'd really love to focus a little bit on something called the privacy paradox, where people really claim that they care about privacy on the one hand, but they really don't care about privacy, at least in their behaviors, right? And so we're saying one thing, behaving in a very different way. And Deneb and Hart actually have a 2006 paper where they talk about the privacy calculus theory, where they suggest there's not actually really a paradox. What it is that people are weighing the costs and benefits associated with sharing, personal data, and they assume or they decide that the self-disclosure is worth the costs. And I think that may be the case in some cases. We may be rationally thinking through things, but Leslie, you've been studying privacy for a long time. It's very hard for me to look at your research and say, oh yeah, these people are, people in general are really weighing things rationally, thinking through this and making careful decisions. And so, your research shows a bunch of different effects and sometimes disturbing effects about how easy it is to get people to reveal their privacy. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about, what is this privacy paradox and what does your research show about the psychology that drives it?
Yeah, so I think that this idea that advanced in Deneb and Hart and others have as well, that this is kind of the outcome of a rational cost-benefit analysis. That's just not descriptively accurate on the whole. Like it's, we have lots of evidence that contradicts that. And I think that there's a lot of put differently, there's a lot of other reasons why. One reason why they say they care about their privacy and then their behavior suggests they don't. One reason is, well, maybe they really don't care about their privacy. That would also be like kind of explain the paradox, but that I think is also not broadly borne out in the data. I think this disconnect is a reflection of how one, we have many desires. Protecting our privacy is one desire, a very important desire. Having privacy is an incredibly important part of being a human, of human development, and so on. But sharing is also incredibly important. And at the moreover, we can feel the desire to share and the desire to keep something private at the very same moment. Like we're truly conflicted. For example, like a secret is a nice example of these two motives operating at the same time. A secret you really want to keep private, but you also really want to share it. So what the heck are you supposed to do? And some of my research and that of others has pointed to how one thing that can move us around in terms of whether we share or reveal is the extent to which a given context plays to one desire over the other, like makes salient one desire over the other, right? So, for example, we found that temporary sharing technologies, so like Snapchat is the prototypical example where when you send something on Snap, when you send a Snap, the recipient can't save it. It kind of disappears as soon as they viewed it. And this plays to your desire to reveal, and it suppresses your privacy concerns because it feels really safe, right? Because your secrets aren't going to follow you. And we've shown that, for example, this is like a design factor, ephemerality, temporariness that increases your propensity to reveal. And we show some potential downsides of this. So one snag here is that, well, it protects your privacy in the strict sense, in the sense that the photo, whatever you send, can't be saved, but the reputational consequences can persist, which we've shown in a series of studies. So put differently, if the promise of temporary sharing causes you to let your guard down and share maybe salacious stuff that you ordinarily wouldn't be comfortable sharing, it does, then if that leaves a bad impression on others, it can. This bad impression persists in the other's mind. It doesn't disappear when the photo disappears. And so that's just kind of one example of a contextual factor that plays differentially to these different desires and can really end up shaping behavior. There's also other reasons why, when we think back to more concretely to your question of this paradox and why do people say they care about privacy, yet their behavior suggests otherwise, I think it is entirely possible and consistent with much research that people truly do care about their privacy, yet still reveal a lot of things suggesting that maybe they don't, but they do. Another factor is just the sheer complexity of these decisions. And this idea that people reveal, that you advance with Dinev and Hart, reveal simply because the costs outweigh the benefits, I think really shrouds this notion that, or maybe assumes, put differently, that people have a really good understanding of the costs and benefits. But these are often shrouded, especially the costs, especially when you think in the marketplace, like the firms have a strong incentive to really make the benefits very salient, and the costs of revealing, even the magnitude of what you're revealing, per what Michal has been saying is amazing research, it's really not apparent. And so you may propose the reasonable question, if people really did understand, if you told them what exactly was happening, they may behave quite differently, I suspect, in many cases. you also see, and then I'll shut up, but one other factor that can help explain some of this disconnect is cognitive biases, right? So in addition to the costs and benefits being extremely complex, often shrouded, hard to understand, we have limited processing capability. On top of that, our decision-making is subject to a variety of biases. And sometimes these biases can go in the exact opposite direction of our privacy desires. So like say, I don't know, an oldie but a goodie, present bias preferences, right? So someone who cares a lot about their privacy and also, like most people, has present bias preferences may reveal in a situation where they get immediate, amazing benefits, costs are delayed, despite caring a lot about their privacy, because in that case, the present bias preference is just kind of stronger or is a powerful force and made salient. That the situation may also play to it such that we see a disconnect. So I could go on, but I'm worried I already am going on too much. So continue.
No, not at all. No. So we'll dig into a lot of those threads as we have our conversation. And I think one of the things that, so Azim would like to turn to you. So you've recently published this great paper on privacy, where you take an evolutionary approach to understanding privacy, and in particular, I think speaks to this privacy paradox from this really interesting perspective of evolution. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, your ideas there in terms of why is it so hard for us in this digital age? We've evolved to figure out the privacy, issues, but we're struggling right now. And so what are you finding here? And what is it that you're talking about when you say there's this evolutionary mismatch?
Yeah, so this builds on a lot of the stuff that Leslie was saying about how there's different salience for the benefits that were fed online and the costs that might be taken from us. As you said, the evolution of a privacy concern system makes sense in the environment in which it evolved. So we figure out a way to regulate our seclusion from and approach towards other people. We figured out a good way with our existing theory of mind to recognize when we want to keep a distance from somebody, whom we want to keep a distance from, how much distance we want to keep, in order to make sure that our information or our self is exposed or not exposed to those people that we want it to be exposed or not exposed to. So for instance, if you and I were having a private conversation about a sensitive matter, and we saw Michal out there somewhere, we would know to kind of reflexively, instinctively lower our voices, calibrate our voices to what we'd expect him to be able to hear. This gets somewhat confounded when we introduce new technologies. So any technology with a sort of superhuman sensory capabilities, if somebody had a video camera that they could see at a distance for. One example I like is from 2001: A Space Odyssey, where you have HAL, this artificial intelligence, and HAL and the interests of the astronauts are sort of misaligned. And so the astronauts want to discuss something without HAL being able to hear. So they go out in the pod, and the pod is protected from HAL, but HAL can see at a distance, and he can see through the little window, and he can read the lips of the astronauts. If they were dealing with a human, they would recognize that, well, we know how much distance to keep. We know that a human wouldn't be able to look at the reflection and still read lips and all this, but they don't have the same machine theory of mind. For HAL, we don't have a instinctive understanding of how to keep our privacy in that situation. When you put things online, it gets even more complicated, because now we're not even dealing with anthropomorphic robots, but you're dealing with a situation where the people with whom you might be sharing information are unseen in any number, in complicated ways, as Michal was talking about. So this creates a sort of a mismatch situation where the carefully calibrated privacy concern system that we have that allows us to pretty effectively work in the offline world now kind of falls apart on the online world. And so we can abstractly recognize all the risks that Leslie's talked about, that Michal has talked about, but we don't feel the same emotional concern that we would if we were sharing the same information in the offline world. So take the present moment bias that Leslie was talking about. You could have that same bias to somebody who is on the street offering you something in a face-to-face conversation for something that you might want in the moment. And you might say, okay, you know what? I want this in the moment, but this guy's right here. I can see the whites of the eyes of the person who's going to be collecting this information from me. I don't want to do it. And so even though you might have the bias, because you're in a situation where the people are face-to-face, you're going to have the emotional aversion to sharing that information directly. But if you're put online, you're now missing that sort of social cue that might raise that concern. And as a result, you might be more inclined to share it. And so I think that the online world has kind of completely befuddled these evolved intuitions we have on how to share stuff.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm wondering what is the right way to get people to care about their privacy, or is that even the right question to be asking, right? And so like, there's this idea, Michal, you've talked about, I've heard you talk about, like, we live in a post-privacy world, and the sooner we start thinking and talking, shifting the conversation to be like, how do we navigate this post-privacy world? How do we live in this post-privacy world? The better, right? As opposed to, should we have privacy or not? Like, it's like, we don't. So to some degree, I would love to hear from each of you. Do you feel like we're living in a post-privacy world? If so, what does that mean? And I think one of the challenges is that even if it is the case that we live in a post-privacy world, there's still different types of privacy that I think we could unpack. Like, there's location data, there's data about our faces, things that we share online. Increasingly, there's data about our bodies, where, DNA, or even tone of voice with Zoom and Clubhouse and things like that. We should be able to assess a lot of information from just tone of voice alone, in terms of even mental health and things like that. So there's a lot of different categories of privacy, and then there's a lot of different degrees of privacy. And so what are your thoughts on that? Do we live in a post-privacy world? What should we be doing about it? Should we be trying to get people to care and take care of their privacy? Or do you feel like that's kind of not a very good approach to go, and we should focus instead on affecting corporations and policy? Who wants to start? Michal, do you?
Well, I think that people definitely should care about privacy, but also we should not expect that individuals to be able to protect the privacy. We live in the world where, essentially, in order to fully participate in the society, you need to be able to communicate with others online, search for information online, purchase things, use online banking, read online newspapers, and so on. And in the process, you are going to be leaving behind digital footprints. And as an individual, you should not, and you will not, understand how the internet protocols work and what's happening to your data. And you also cannot ascertain that the company that is taking your credit card details and processing the purchase of something online, you cannot be held responsible for how they protect this data, simply because how could you have enough time, and also how could you get enough technological knowledge if even people responsible for this make mistakes? And the best example is that even governments and companies that hire entire departments focused on protecting data still can be hacked, and still their data leaks. So essentially, the bottom line is, we're living in a world where a motivated third party, be it a Russian government or a Bay Area startup, is going to be able to either collect or purchase data about each one of us. So while I'm a big fan of everyone here, and me as well, having as much privacy as possible, I also believe that, first of all, we should expect good policies that essentially establish norms and establish expectations towards big companies, and create incentives and punishments for institutions that do not protect data. But also, on top of this, we should also be aware that even the best policies that are aimed at reducing the risk of fire are not going to prevent fires in all cases. And the same relates to data. Even the best practices and policies aimed at protecting our data will not guarantee us 100% safety. So we should essentially also, in parallel, try to work on organizing the society and legal systems in such a way as to make sure that even if our data is exposed and our privacy is gone, and that we are not going to pay excessive price for it. And on top of everything else, I also want to point out that we should live in a society where if someone wants to give up their privacy and share information about their religious views, political views, sexual orientation, or whatever else they please, we should organize society in such a way as to make sure that it's safe to do. Advising people from religious minorities or political minorities or sexual minorities that, the solution to the societal problems and the solutions of intolerance and homophobia and so on is, well, just keep your data to yourself. It's just not, I don't believe that this is the right way to go. The right way to go is to making sure that we can all safely share our data and expect not to be punished for it.
And Leslie, like you may have a different direction you want to go with this, but I'm curious about your thoughts on this question of whether we live in a post-privacy world and how to best navigate that. And I know that you've done a lot of thinking about what corporations will do, such as like informed consent. So does informed consent, is that a good system? Does that work well for people? Or is that kind of a broken system? And is the idea that companies should be making it easier for people to make choices, or is it out of our hands? Are we just incapable of processing all of this and making good decisions? And another example of your recent work is you've found some work on cost transparency, where with food, for example, we'll buy chicken noodle soup if we make it transparent what are the ingredients, right? And so then we feel like, okay, I know what I'm eating. People are more likely to purchase it. Does that work in this case, where if we raise awareness of the costs of privacy sharing, is that a good solution, or is that just something where companies will like give a couple of pieces of information and then hide the rest of it? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on all this.
Yeah, it's big, thorny, important questions. We have our jobs for lifetime, right? It's unlimited questions for us to look at with research. I think, well, first of all, on the narrow question of, are we living in a post-privacy world? Like, I don't even know what that means. And statements like, is privacy dead? Privacy is like, I find those terms very imprecise. And so sorry, I'm being a bit crabby at that. They're, kind of sexy terms, but I'm not really sure what they even mean. I think that broadly, we want to be able to, this is going to sound overly simplistic, realize the benefits of the availability of personal data while mitigating the pitfalls. And so I'm saying that partly to underscore that at the individual level, the goal is not just don't share, be more protective all the time, right? Because I think sometimes we don't reveal enough and we miss out on opportunities. For example, we have some work on interpersonal sharing, and people sometimes don't share when actually it would help their relationships if they did share, even unflattering information. There's often benefits. So clearly the answer isn't like we should just like tamp it down. It's a matter of understanding when to do it and how to do it well. But I don't want it to sound like people just suck at decisions here. I really think that, echoing a lot of what Michal was saying, like the deck is kind of stacked against consumers in the marketplace to make good decisions, or at least to make informed decisions in a sense. And a reason for that is again, echoing what Michal was saying, is incentives, right? There's firms right now have a giant incentive to get like tons and tons of personal data, even like trick people into sharing, while putting kind of as few constraints on what they can do, promising as little as possible. And so I think fundamentally what would be very helpful in this space is regulations, policies that align the incentives better, right? That give firms a sincere interest in protecting consumers' privacy, respecting their expectations about how their data ought to be shared and handled and managed. We are, actively conducting research on what those expectations are. They can be quite context dependent, but I think right now that the tricky thing with some of these regulatory approaches is that they don't address this fundamental incentive that firms have. And so, so until you do that, and so one way of doing that is, just to be a bit more concrete, Jack Balkin and Jonathan Zittrain have this interesting idea of an information fiduciary, which essentially, just like firms, sometimes have a, financial fiduciaries, an information fiduciary would be firms are required to essentially respect consumers' expectations about how their data ought to be shared. And if not, they're financially accountable for that. I think that until we have some kind of reckoning of this issue of misaligned incentives, it's pretty hard to come up with really good ways of, letting both consumers and firms alike realize the benefits while mitigating the pitfalls. And to just give some examples here on some issues, if you don't align the incentives, where, you talked about transparency and control, those are like things that we like, right? They sound really great, and they are often really great. But in my view, if you don't address the underlying incentive issue, although control can often be very good and helpful to consumers, same with transparency, they can also be kind of weaponized and used to get people to potentially share more without their knowledge or really their consent. So Alessandro Acquisti and Laura Brandemart and George Lowenstein have done some interesting work that documents that you can give people an illusion of control and induce them to share when they otherwise probably should not. Similarly, we found in some work on how, like, just making people feel in control, even when that control is not substantive, that can make them, for example, comfortable with targeted advertising that they would otherwise find invasive. So, for example, I'm laughing because, not because this isn't like important and troubling the finding, but because it's just this. I should tell you the study. It's a bit ridiculous in the sense that we tell people, hey, you can have control over what you use as your screensaver background, like something that has nothing to do with what behaviorally targeted ads I see. And then when you tell them this relative to when you don't, they become more accepting of things that they ordinarily find invasive, like third-party, ads that are generated based on third-party tracking and so on. So although there's like some promise in these approaches to control and transparency, there's always also some downsides that they can be kind of used in not the spirit that they're kind of intending to be used.
Yeah, that reminds me of the Azim and your work on evolutionary, the evolution of privacy, where it's like we feel like if I have a little bit of control in the situation, that's a signal that everything is okay or things are good. Give me a cookie, a piece of pizza or something like that. And this is like we're sharing food, and this is like I've evolved to feel like that's a good, safe situation and a good place for me to share a lot of data. But Azim, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I agree with the other two. I mean, I think that placing the onus on the individual for all these reasons is an unwise move. Unfortunately, it seems to be the move that a lot of people are taking, even if it wasn't the case that the complexity of these privacy intrusions hasn't risen to the level where it's so hard for people to understand. And even if we weren't riddled with all these biases that Leslie's talking about, I just don't even think it would be worth the time that it would take for every individual to be able to learn about this and track it for each of the websites that they visit or each of the tools that they use. There's some things which we need to do ourselves, and then there's many things in which we have a division of labor for. We are increasingly specialized. It seems like the task of protecting privacy for the public should be something which is left to specialized experts who are our advocates, whose job it is to fully understand what's going on, recognize what our wishes are, and then try to figure out a way to make those happen. I'm in Europe at the moment, and I've been noticing some differences between here and North America. One thing that I've really liked, well, one thing I've really disliked is the GDPR stuff that is more on steroids. It seems like when I'm on the net, it's more on steroids here than it is in North America. Every time I'm on a website, even as somebody who's been researching this privacy stuff recently, it's just, you just want to dismiss it as quickly as possible. And part of that is because, you know, going with the evolutionary stuff, the websites are offering us stuff which is very evolutionarily titillating. There are things like sharing people, seeing people, talking to people that you know. These are things which we've evolved to care about. And then they're trying to, the small price that they're actually asking for is in this bloodless legalese, which is just not what captures our attention at all. It's just annoying. It's talked about in a way which is not emotionally evocative. You just want to get rid of it. So that's not the way to do it, right? That relying on the individuals to be able to take care of themselves, take care of this for themselves is not the way to do it. But one thing that I've noticed, which is neat, is that when you advertise for houses or when you sell food, they have a rating, like a A, B, C, D rating for, say, how nutritious this is. They simplify it down to A, B, C, D, or how energy efficient is the house, A, B, C, D. If you could have companies that were rated on this A, B, C, D, so you could quickly understand how much data are being taken. Say the advocates who work for us could give us that information, then we could choose between them and choose which of these organizations might be more aligned with our privacy interests.
Riffing on what Azim is saying, I couldn't agree more. Fundamentally, I'm just pining for policy to be based on like real human beings, like how people actually behave, not econs, not some specimen from outer space, but like how, like, people don't read privacy policies. It's not a reasonable expectation for them, given the sheer number we encounter, given how complicated they are, and so on. The cookie thing, right? Do we really think that people are giving like real consent? Like, no, they're just pressing yes because it's annoying and it's choice fatigue. And to your point, you get an immediate titillating sometimes, you know, outcome when you get to see the content, right? It's just such a tease if you don't. So yeah, I just broadly, something we need to really base policies on like a real understanding of how people actually are, warts and all.
The famous studies on this show that if you slip in little gotcha phrases, like you
give us your firstborn in the privacy, yeah.
And it's something crazy, like 95% of people who read this, so they set up a fake social media account that you could sign up for, and they gave people this list, and included in that was you're giving us your firstborn, and basically nobody catches it. And then the other studies show, so in 2008, there's this famous study that calculated how much time it would take to actually read all the things you're signing up for. And it was something like 12 full days without sleeping. And then 4 years later, it was double that. And so now with the GDPR stuff, who knows, it's probably half your waking hours to actually do all this. So obviously nobody's going to do it.
And there's another problem. There is no choice really, because very often you do not have an alternative. Like there's no alternative to Google. There's no alternative to, you know, Facebook or Instagram. Really, people say, well, there are other websites. Well, but my friends are not on the other websites. And I really want to read this article and I want to use this search. And now if I just can't really understand why we essentially have this theater where, you know, everyone asks for the permission to use to put a cookie on your computer and maybe harvest your organs and, you know, get your firstborn, but we don't really give consumers to you know, an alternative. So I love the idea, Azim, of your kind of privacy rating, but we should not forget then that also services that actually collect data about you can be better. Because knowing your consumer, let's say in the context of a search engine or recommendation system, the more you know about a consumer, the better this system can work. So we also have to accept that sometimes it's just in the interest of a consumer actually to share as much information as possible with a particular platform, and then trust that this information is not used for nefarious purposes, but only to improve the experience of the consumer.
So one of the things, and just to kind of, I guess, push back on individual responsibility just a little bit, I agree with all of what you're saying, but I have this real strong tension in my mind between heading down a path where individuals have no responsibility or, at all, and it's all about, we need to rely on companies or policymakers or whatnot to make decisions on behalf of us. And on the flip side, we are overmatched, and there's no way that individuals can process all of this. You can't read all the stuff. We can't educate everybody on how to, respond well to privacy. But I think there may be a place for educating people and perhaps having public opinion kind of like put the pressure to do something about this or to make changes on this. But I guess I worry because I don't like either path. I don't like the path of like, individuals shouldn't have to be dealing with this. We abdicate our responsibility. And I don't like the other path either. And then a third piece that makes it a little bit complicated is, I think, as I've talked to a lot of people about privacy, they feel a lot of pressure, like they're supposed to be protecting their privacy. They know they're not, they don't know how. And so they feel a lot of anxiety about this. Maybe just letting them off the hook would be a kindness, psychologically say there's nothing, individuals can do, just, use your products and get on with your life. What do you think about these tensions? How do we resolve these tensions? Like, is there any role? I guess one specific question is there any role for individuals to be educated and to take any sort of action whatsoever on this front, on the privacy front?
Well, I think, we kind of do this dance with politics in general, right? We trust our leaders to be able to consult experts and figure out policies which represent our interests. We still have to demonstrate what our interests are. So I think that the individual responsibility is to recognize sort out what values we actually care about. I'm not a privacy absolutist by any means. In certain situations, I think that probably we care too much about privacy. But for the public to sort out when they care about privacy, how much they care about privacy, how much they balance it against the other values, communicate that to hopefully these people who can advocate for us, who understand how to bring those interests to light, and then let experts who really know what they're talking about and what the various details of the risks are take over from there.
And I just want to add to what Azim said, that people sometimes react instinctively by saying, okay, let me just leave Facebook and leave all of those online environments and try to essentially, escape the risks. And I can completely see this, but also I don't think it's a good solution because first of all, people will pay cost individually for leaving, the spaces and platforms where information is being exchanged, where friends are interacting, but others also pay the price. If you leave Facebook, then your friends will lose benefit of interacting with you. Discussions will suffer from you not being there. There's going to be less funny cat pictures and funny goat pictures. So this is all bad. And also we should not forget that just many people just can't do that. Maybe, we could go to a local bank branch and use, 20th century banking approach in order to limit our online digital footprint. But there are people out there, single parents, people that have to work 3 jobs, people that don't live next to the bank, that will have to continue online banking. And there's also people out there that are much more exposed to risks of losing their privacy. If I lose my privacy and people, learn about my views and my preferences and so on, I live in an environment, I'm lucky to live in the environment where I will pay the price, but this price is going to be very limited. Now, not everyone is as privileged as I am. And I'm thinking essentially that instead of escaping and saying, well, I'm just going to stop taking those risks, maybe it's better to continue taking those risks and put pressure on companies and policymakers and politicians and each other to try to solve those problems, not only for ourselves, but also for the others. And I just want to add one other little piece of information here that I think I was not reminded of enough, which is that losing our privacy also involves a trade-off here. Companies that make money on our data do not have to charge us for using products and services. And while people living in the Bay Area would say, well, I would gladly pay $5 or $10 or $20 for using this particular platform if they just didn't sell my data, keep forgetting that a person in India or Bangladesh or Poland cannot pay $20 to use this service. And now the business model that is essentially selling us or our data and providing companies money or kind of income in this way, rather than charging for use of the platform, is for many people out there extremely beneficial, because otherwise they would not be able to avoid using the services that we here on this call pay for with our data.
Great. Well, let's turn our attention a little bit to research and what the field can do. And one of the conversation, or one of the themes here that we've talked about so far, is it would be helpful to have experts who are on top of things and helping to guide, I guess, decision making. And I guess I would note two things. One is that there isn't wide agreement about who those experts should be. So that's a whole conversation in and of itself that the public would need to have. But the second is, regardless of who those experts are, they need to be informed by really good, solid research, which is what the Psych of Tech Institute is all about, and I know all of you are all about. And so and I know a lot of researchers are listening to this, and so what are some good dissertation ideas? What are some good directions for the research to be headed? What questions should we be asking, either as psychologists, organizational behavior scholars, marketers, et cetera? Like where should we go with the research?
You made me think of a cozy memory that my mom was telling me about my brother. When he was little, he used to, when she tucked him in at night, he used to worry, what's going to be my dissertation topic? I have to, we're like super nerdy family. He's like, it has to be a unique thing that nobody ever has looked at. How am I going to come up with that? So dissertation topic. Yeah, I mean, I think there's just, sorry, Greg, for outing your sweet soul, sweet nerdly soul. Yeah, I think that there's just so much. It's like the more research I do, the more ideas are uncovered of new things to study. And one thing just off the top of my head that's salient from what Azim was talking about is this idea of like kind of offline norms, and how like in the offline non-digital world, we've kind of evolved to navigate conversations, to navigate information sharing in certain ways. And then when we kind of import these norms or these modes to the online world, where they kind of oftentimes don't seem to really apply, or they can be exploited. And I'm really fascinated in that question of what be kind of where things kind of are a disconnect and where they may not be, and then opportunities that may present also opportunities for interventions. Like maybe it makes sense to try to import some of these, like make digital environments feel more reminiscent of the offline world, to help us in a way better navigate some of the risks and the rewards. Like here's one kind of salient example in my mind, which would be earlier we were talking about how when you share on social media, it's kind of unimaginable in a way who your real audience is. And imagine whereas if you're sharing something sensitive in a non-digital environment, you're like writing a letter, who you're addressing it to, or you're in front of people and who they are, or maybe there's some corners that people could be hiding around, but you're like, you can see the corners, so you may modulate appropriately. Imagine if on, for example, Facebook, when you share something, you like maybe a random sample of who your friends are, the images appear to kind of as a reminder of like who the audience is, or who a sampling of that audience. But that's the idea of kind of the backdrop of the evolutionary basis of privacy, I think is super interesting. Obviously, that's not my area, evolution, but I think we can take some of those ideas, even as like behavioral experimentalists, and use those to inform some of the work we're doing moving forward.
Great.
Yeah, I think one area which would really benefit from psychological research is to really articulate where the costs of privacy intrusions lie. Some of those are technical things, but a lot of them are psychological things. And as I've been arguing, I think, and actually we've all been arguing, that we are sort of untethered psychologically from an intuitive grasp of the costs of privacy intrusions. Philosophers have talked about this a lot, and legal scholars have talked about it a lot. More recently, there has been empirical work done by, well, people like Leslie, but also computer scientists. But I feel like because of this unintuitive recognition of the costs, it would be important for psychologists to really actually do the studies to show the magnitude of the psychological effects that having your privacy intruded upon actually have, not just how big these effects might be. So here's an example, right? So one thing that they talk about in the law and the philosophy is that this can be a drag on creativity, or it can be a drag on developing intimacy. It can be a drag on freedom of thought, because if you feel surveilled, you might rein in how much you're willing to talk about with people, how much you're willing to think, how much you're willing to share. If it's not being just shared with a small group, but with a large group, if you know it's visible, you're not going to think as extreme thoughts. You're not going to even play around with those thoughts. That stuff hasn't, I think, been well demonstrated psychologically. It may be that that's a very large effect, which would be very concerning. It may be that it's a small effect. And if it is a small effect, we should know that as well, because if there are these trade-offs, if we are balancing, say, keeping our privacy versus, say, the economic benefit of having access to these tools that these companies are providing, or public safety, which can be traded off against privacy, or efficiency, all these things. If the costs are small, we should know that it's maybe not worth giving those, it's maybe worth paying those in order to get these other benefits that privacy is being traded off against. One thing I've noticed as I've entered this field, I'm new to this privacy research, but most of the privacy scholars that I've read tend to also be privacy advocates. So they tend to be very concerned about privacy. And I worry that might skew the literature in a way where you don't have people with more dispassionate, nuanced views of when privacy is valuable, when maybe we get over-exercised about it. So actually delineating the magnitude of the costs of privacy, I think, is a worthy goal for psychologists.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
And another, yeah, it's very interesting. Another on the cost is consideration of like the magnitude, but also the frequency and the number of people that experience those. Right? Is it extreme costs narrowed to a few people, or you could imagine the total cost being the same, but a very different structure, like a very small cost to each person, but everybody experiences it. Yeah, lots of interesting work there.
And there is safety in numbers, right? Like we saw this before where, in early times of the gay rights movement, people were advocating for coming out if one can afford this, and essentially losing the privacy of the sexual orientation. And Harvey Milk was one of the advocates. As we know, Harvey Milk paid the highest price for losing their privacy, but then he and other heroes also paved the way for the rest of us to live in a much more tolerant society. And perhaps the same could apply to online space, where giving people right to privacy as much as possible is an important thing to do, but also encouraging people to essentially drive the change and change the world in such a way as to, as for it to become safe to lose our privacy is probably an equally, if not more important of a mission.
That's a great vision, and so we have time for one last question, which really builds on that point, Michal, which is when you think about the future. I think a lot of times researchers and others are just trying to grapple with the day that we live in right now and what's happening today. But what about 500 years from now, or maybe just to make it a little bit more easier for us, 50 years from now? What do you envision? Like, what would the ideal scenario be 50 years from now in terms of privacy in the digital realm for humans? What's your vision? What's your grand vision of if we get everything right? What is it going to look like?
Well, I hope that essentially maybe not even 50, maybe just 5 or 10 years from now, people would just care much less. Companies will find ways of making money without, selling our data and doing similar creepy things. And people would find other activities in life apart from, being homophobic and prejudiced on the grounds of religion and political views. And we will just be able to focus on the real problems that we have in the society, which is, for example, the rise of the intelligent machines and issues related to climate and poverty and so on.
Yeah, that's right. Thinking on the 500-year timescale, where all our bones will have been ground into paper by some super intelligent machine, so we don't have to really worry about that. I think that the 5-10-year timescale is really the one to focus on. On the 50 or 100 or 500-year timescale, my expectation is that our moral values will have changed so much, such that the people in 50 years or 100 years are going to look back on maybe some of these discussions and think that we were totally misguided in terms of the balance of the values that we had. And that might be the consequence of us not taking enough precautions against a slippery slope into some post-privacy world. But maybe, we'll redraw a line between privacy and transparency that'll be radically different from where we put the line right now. And we'll either have gone way in one direction where there's much more privacy or much more transparency, and we will have accommodated our moral values to that new society. I think I'm just influenced by a paper that I recently read by John Donaher, who some of you guys know, the philosopher, about this concept of what he calls axiological futurism, which is the idea that moral values change, and we should be open to the fact that maybe they're going to systematically change in ways that we can't predict and are going to be very foreign to what we believe right now.
Maybe one measure of success is, like what future generations look back on us, say, I wish, what idiots, why didn't they do this for us? They've set us up to fail, If you ask me, one of the things that I think we really need to get sorted is this, firms versus consumers. It shouldn't be versus, but how to kind of align our motives in a way, and so that we can realize the benefits without kind of trying to trick each other, or we can realize the benefits while mitigating the pitfalls in a fair and reasonable way.
Mm-hmm.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, wonderful. Well, great answers. And well, thank you all so much for this really fascinating conversation. Hopefully it inspires others to continue thinking about this important topic and do more research on it, and set better policy and design, policies around it. So Leslie, Michal, Azim, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Bye.